So I like to preface this lecture by posing the question, whether rhetorically or if you want to discuss it. Um, if you don't have a job, do you consider yourself unemployed? So um, a lot of you, most of you might just say, yes, I don't have a job, therefore I'm unemployed. Isn't just like the distinction of saying not employed. So what else would there be? Well, the reality is that there are groups of people that you might not want to consider unemployed for the sake of doing a calculation of unemployment, because the reason why you're unemployed or why they may be unemployed is because of the fact that they have something else that's kind of occupying their time. They might not be receiving uh, compensation for what they're doing, but they're building towards something else and it's occupying a significant portion of their time. So this is the
Stay-at-home moms or
exactly.
dads.
Yes.
Athletes.
Yes. Full-time students, full-time student athletes, full-time parents. Those are categories of people that are not considered unemployed by definition of how we consider things as unemployed, because of the fact that they've got so much else going on. They don't necessarily need to be working on top of it. Now, that doesn't mean that you aren't. So I'm sure half this class is doing the full-time that, and then also doing a full-time job, and also being a full-time student. So you might be doing 3 of them all at the same time, or 2 of them. But because of the fact that you have all those duties, if you aren't working while doing one of those other things, you are not considered to be unemployed. And then also think about retirees as well. They might be on the tennis court behind me in Florida or something, just hitting volleys to each other instead of being interested in working because they worked enough, or they worked enough to where they could save enough where they didn't have to work anymore. So not having a job does not necessarily make you unemployed. So by like a literal definition of unemployed, you'd think, yeah, I'm not working, therefore I'm unemployed. But if we're trying to create a metric or a measurement of unemployment that's going to accurately depict who is and isn't in the job market, which is going to help us make policies to get people employed, then you are going to not want to skew that data. You want to have a more accurate depiction of what is considered unemployed. So here's the specific definition of unemployed as we use it in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, also known as the BLS, we talked about them with Consumer Price Index. So with the Consumer Price Index, they are the bureau or agency that reports that information every single month. That same agency is also in conjunction with the Census Bureau conducting surveys to calculate a monthly unemployment rate. So to the nearest 1/10%, what is the unemployment rate in the United States in January, in February, in March? So I think the February unemployment rate will come out in the first week of March. The January unemployment rate came out in the first week of February, and every single month subsequently, give or take. Like if the first day of the month is the first Friday, then they typically wait till the 8th. But otherwise, they almost always release it on the first Friday of the month. But anyways, in order for them to calculate the unemployment rate, they have to have a strict definition of unemployed, and this is that strict definition. There are 2 elements that need to be satisfied. The first element is that you have to have not worked in the previous week. Now, that doesn't mean that you were on vacation or that you were out sick with COVID or you were out sick with any sort of other illness. What it speaks to is that you did not work in the previous week because you didn't have a job. So if you're temporarily away from your job for a number of reasons, maternity leave, vacation, sick leave, bereavement, any of those reasons why you're not working in the past week, those do not count. It is that you don't have a job in the past week, and that's why you didn't work. And on top of that, you have to be actively seeking employment in the last 4 weeks. So I'm not sure if anyone claimed unemployment during the COVID shutdowns or have claimed unemployment at any time in your working lives or working careers. But in terms of collecting unemployment, there's usually a requirement that you have to apply for X number of jobs every week. So I collected unemployment once in my life in 2018. And one of the conditions of it was that I had to apply for at least 2 jobs a week. And so that basically allows for you to fit under the definition of unemployed that we have here, that I don't have a job, but by virtue of sending you this information where I applied for this job and here's their phone number, and I applied for this job and here's their phone number, I'm justifying that I am actively seeking employment, and thus, therefore, I should be entitled or eligible for unemployment compensation. And so, for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is the definition that needs to be satisfied in order for you to be considered unemployed. If you fit any sort of other wishy-washy definition where you're not working, but there's something that is impeding you from applying for jobs in the past month, then you're not considered part of the labor force. You're not considered unemployed. You're not considered part of the labor force. So what is the labor force? The labor force is basically going to be the sum of those who are actually working and those who are not working but trying to work. And that is the universe and the scope in which we base the unemployment rate on. So the unemployment rate that you see published in all the news articles and on the BLS website every single month, that is based on the proportion of the labor force that is unemployed, not the proportion of the population. Labor force also might be the replacement to the Avengers. So I know they had 87 million movies about Captain America and Iron Man and all these other characters, and then they had a movie a couple years ago that ended the series. Well, my recommendation for substitution for the next great comic book movie is the labor force. It's just a bunch of regular people working their jobs and a bunch of regular people trying to find jobs. And there's nothing heroic. There's nothing super heroic about it, but there is something heroic about making sure that the society functions in terms of food to eat and places to sleep and warm blankets and infrastructure. So the labor force, as I mentioned before, is just the sum of the employed and unemployed workers in the economy. So if you are employed, if you have a job, and honestly, the threshold is very low. So a person that makes $20 a week in not $20 a week, $20 in a 2-week period is considered employed. So the bar is very low. If you are surveyed and you say, just because you don't have a W-2 coming in, if you're being paid under the table for a job and someone asks you, are you employed? And you say, how much money did you make? You say $20. They'll consider you unemployed. They'll check you on the box as being employed. Now, this can create problems because we're not necessarily interested in a metric that is only talking about who has a job or who doesn't have a job relative to the people that are in the labor force. We're also interested in making sure that the jobs are of a certain level of quality, so that way not everybody's working for minimum wage. So part-time workers, they're employed. Full-time workers, they're employed. People that are making $20 because they helped mow their neighbor's lawn one time in the last 2 weeks, they're considered employed. So there's not some strict minimal standard for being considered employed other than that you have done some sort of income generating work in the past 2 weeks. Unlike unemployed, where you specifically have to have not worked and you specifically have to have actively sought employment. Now, what this means is that if you are not fitting that definition of unemployed or working, then you are omitted from the labor force. So the people that are omitted from the labor force are those who are of working age. So the definition of working age population is people that are 16 years of age or older. So you could be working under 16, but you're not considered of working age yet. So in terms of the traditional labor force, you're going to be the proportion of the proportion of the working age population that is 16 or older and is working or is actively seeking work but not currently working. And as we mentioned before, there's groups of individuals that are not considered in the labor force. So retirees, full-time students, homemakers, the disabled, and a couple other groups that are of working age, but they have no intention to work or they're not available to work. So we don't want to consider them unemployed for the sake of potentially overstating the actual rate of unemployment. So if you get a table of information that says, okay, there's part-time workers, there's full-time workers, there's people who have not worked in the last week and have actively sought work in the last 4 weeks, those categories of individuals are considered part of the labor force. If they are discouraged workers, which we'll talk about, marginally attached workers, which we'll talk about, the underemployed, which we'll talk about, or any sort of other group of like retirees or full-time students or the disabled, they will not count as part of the labor force for the official unemployment rate. Now, they may be included in a different unemployment rate because, contrary to what a lot of articles and people think, there's more than one unemployment rate. There's actually 6 of them. So the official unemployment rate is the one that we spend most of our time talking about. But if there are groups of people that you think should be included in the unemployment rate, or if you want a better barometer of the status of the economy based on people who have part-time jobs but want better jobs, or people who probably should be considered unemployed but aren't because they haven't fit the strict definition of it, there is other unemployment rates that allow for you to be satisfied in terms of including those people. So again, the philosophy is we don't want to include everybody that is of working age in the unemployment rate calculation because they may have other things that they need to be doing, like taking care of their family, taking care of their studies. Maybe they physically don't have the ability to work and they're collecting some sort of disability insurance or Social Security payment in exchange for that. People that have turned 77 years old and they've decided that they're going to hit the golf course or the boat dock or the tennis court or wherever retired people retire these days. Whether it's Arizona, Florida, golf courses, Europe, I don't know where they retire these days because I'm too far away from it. But anyways, the proportion of the labor force that is considered unemployed is going to be our unemployment rate. So it's not going to be the proportion of the working age population. Now, the working age population is going to be relevant when we calculate a different thing known as the labor force participation rate. But in terms of the actual unemployment rate, all those groups don't get included. So here is the official way to calculate the official, aka the U3 estimate of the unemployment rate. It is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. So again, the BLS monthly report rounds it to the nearest 1/10%. And for an example here, if we just so happen to have 95 million people that are employed by the definition of employed, so if we have 95 million people, that includes part-time workers, full-time workers, under-the-table workers that publicly admitted to being working under the table in the unemployment survey. If you have 95 million employed workers estimated from the survey as employed, and you have 5 million people that have been estimated as unemployed, then what you would do is you would take the 5 million unemployed persons, put that in the numerator, also put that in the denominator, and then in the denominator, add in the number of employed workers, which will give you 95 million plus 5 million. And then you end up with 5 million divided by 100 million. That millions cancel out. You're left with 5 over 100. This cancels. Your unemployment rate is 5%. So I did a straw poll in another class of 24 students, and I asked them how many of them were employed and how many of them they considered to be unemployed and how many of them considered themselves to not be part of the labor force. I had 12 students who said that they were employed. I had 6 students who said they were unemployed, and I had 6 students who said they were not in the labor force. So from that group of students, the labor force is going to be the sum of these two, which is 18. The number of unemployed is 6. So 6 divided by 18 is equal to 1/3, which is equal to 0.333. And if you multiply that times 100, the unemployment rate would be 33.3%. So that's how you calculate unemployment. It's just the proportion of the labor force that is unemployed. We don't want to include people that are not part of the labor force because they're unavailable for some reason. And we don't need to dig into why. We will dig into why, but for the sake of the official unemployment, we don't dig into why. We just treat them as not part of the labor force and then just base the unemployment rate on who is unemployed based on who is trying to work or is working. Now, as I mentioned before, working age population, the group of people that are living in the country or citizens that are of 16 years of age or older, that is going to still be relevant. So again, if you still have a table of people that are part-time workers, full-time workers, unemployed, discouraged workers, retirees, full-time students, homemakers, the disabled, if you have a big old table that includes all of those people, only some of them will be counted in the labor force, but all of them, assuming they're all of 16 years of age or older, will be included in the working age population. And so that total group of people that is 16 or older will be included in the denominator of the labor force participation rate. And then the numerator of the labor force participation rate is the denominator of the unemployment rate. So the labor force goes up top here, and then it goes in the bottom on unemployment. So
is there a maximum? Sorry, excuse me.
Go ahead.
So I know that you have said that the age for working age population is 16 or older.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an age that cuts off at, like at 65, when it's the technical age of retirement, or does it go until death?
Goes until death. There are some textbooks and there are some definitions that try to narrow it down to 16 to 65, but there's a good proportion of the population that is over 65 that is working. And if we were to just basically automatically consider them retired, even though they clearly are not, I feel like that would do just as bad as if we were including, or if we're excluding too many people, it's just as bad as including too many people.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
In terms of the estimator. So There's a commercial on YouTube, so I would share it here, but unfortunately, when you share videos on the screen share, it doesn't really come through very well. So what I would recommend is that you go to YouTube or whatever video sharing website that you use. I would assume YouTube's the one because I can't think of any others that are going to have the content that I'm looking for. But if you go to YouTube and you type in E-Trade 85 and want to go home, there's a E-Trade commercial from, I don't know if it was a Super Bowl a few years ago or if it was just a general commercial. And basically it's a commercial to Deo, and it's basically 85-year-old people that are doing like DJing and lifeguarding and firefighting because they don't have any savings, because they've worked their whole lives but they haven't been able to save for retirement. So here they are at 85 years old still working like alongside 20-year-olds because of the fact that they can't afford to retire. And so I always share that in like an in-person version of this lecture because of the fact that the reality is that there are lots of people that are over 65 that have no intention of retiring and or need to keep working to be able to sustain themselves. And so I think if we were just to kind of cut them off in terms of the estimator of unemployment versus employment, it would kind of really skew the labor force in a way that I don't think is appropriate. So, but it is a good question because when I used to teach in the past with a different book, there was one book that didn't cut it off, and then there was one book that did. And so, to me, I think that the former is better than the latter because of the fact there is plenty of people. And also, by the time, I'm just going to assume that the entire group in the class is under 50. But if not, even if you are over 50, I've had students that are 68, 69 years old in the past. So I shouldn't be making a judgment on this in this regard. But let's just say that you are under 50. If you're under 50 years old, chances are 65 is not going to be the retirement age by the time you get there. Chances are it's going to be 67, 69, 71, something higher than it is right now. Now, that was based on the fact that life expectancy is continuously growing, but over the past 2 years, life expectancy in the United States has dropped, so maybe it won't. But I would reasonably infer that the retirement age will be even higher when anyone under the age of 50 is 65. It won't be 65. Now, you might be able to retire before 65 or at 65, but based on Social Security, A, might not even be there, but B, it'll probably be there, but you'll have to wait longer. So, so from that regard, I would reasonably conclude that you should include those that are over the age of 65 as well. They won't be included in the labor force, that's for sure. And so that is one thing that is a little bit interesting about the labor force participation rate that I actually haven't thought about before, is that based on how bloated a particular generation is, so like the baby boomers are bigger than Gen X, and then the millennials are bigger than Gen X, and Gen Z is probably also bigger than Gen X. But the reality is that because boomers are older, there's probably a bigger downward pressure on the labor force participation rate than, I don't know, 20 years from now when Gen Xers are in the boomer age and millennials are kind of in between the like mid-career towards like some of them getting close to the end of their careers. So labor force participation rate still isn't perfect, but it does give us some extra context as to what the unemployment rate is doing and whether or not we're in a good situation or not. So for the working age population, you include everybody, employed, unemployed, because if you didn't include them, then you would end up getting a number that's over 100% most likely, because there's usually more people working and unemployed than there aren't. So working age population is everybody over 16. The labor force is just those who are employed or, by our definition of unemployment, unemployed.
Would you be able to do an example, like a very simple, like doesn't even really have to, it could be like one, but just like defining, I guess, because it sounds confusing when it's like all getting thrown, like what is included, what is not included, how to put that, if you're able to do that.
Sure, for
Thank
sure.
you.
So here's an example. I have all this space, so I was planning on doing one anyways. The first one I'll do is the one from that straw poll of the class earlier. And that is, we have 12 people who are employed. We have 6 people who are unemployed. We have 6 people who are not in the labor force. So there was 24 people in the class, so there's 24 people in the working age population. That's it. And then of those 24, 12 plus 6 is 18 people were in the labor force. So 18 over 24 is 3/4. 3/4 is 0.75 times 100. You get a 75% labor force participation rate. So that's the very simple one, but the one on the homework might be a little bit more complicated. So I will do one like that. So let's say we have a group of people that are included here where we have, I don't know, we have 5 people that are unemployed. We have 10 part-time workers, 20 full-time workers. We have 2 discouraged workers, which I'll get to in a second later on in the lecture as to where they're supposed to fall. We have 30 retirees. We have 20 full-time students. So add all this up. That's your working age population. We're assuming all of these people are over 16. You just literally add everybody up. That goes in the bottom. So we got 5 plus 10 plus 20. That's 35. Plus 2 is 37. Plus 30 is 67. Plus 20 is 87. 52. 72, 82, 87. So 87 goes in the bottom. The people that are considered part of the labor force are people that are unemployed or employed. Discouraged workers don't have a job. Retirees don't have a job and aren't looking for one. Discouraged workers aren't looking for it either. Full-time students don't have a job and they're not looking either, so they don't count. Unemployed by our definition counts, so that's 5. Part-time workers count because they're employed, 10. Full-time workers count because they're employed, 20. And then you're left with 35 over 87 as your answer. And whatever that boils down to as a percentage is the correct answer. So if I pull out my handy dandy calculator, you end up with 35 over 87, about 40.2% is your LFPR for this example. So that's how you would determine the labor force participation rate. And then for the unemployment rate for this example, all these people don't matter. The labor force goes in the bottom, which would be 35. You have 5 unemployed, so the unemployment rate, is going to be 5 over 35, which is 1 over 7, which is, I think, 0.18 something, 0.14285. So you got 14.3% as your unemployment rate. So that's how you find them. It's just a matter of making sure you know what counts and what doesn't. Just like the GDP stuff, it's a matter of knowing what counts and what doesn't. So like I'm not trying to make it messy in the calculation for the sake of making you learn how to do math. It's more so just really making sure that you understand what counts and what doesn't, because the unemployment rate is very specific in terms of what is counting. And so like the next slides that we'll talk about are groups of people that probably should count as unemployed, but we can't count them because of the definition that we've provided. But the good news is that we still count them in a different unemployment calculation. So that way, if you're like really adamant that they should be considered unemployed, there's a number for you. It's just not the official one. And it's reported alongside all the other ones, but for some reason, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times like to yell at economists and say, like, why are you hiding this information when, like, clearly in order for you to have found the information, we had to have reported it to you. And then they're like, oh, but why don't you report it? It's like, no, why don't you report it? Because you're the one that took it and only reported one thing. The reason why I have a bone to pick about this is like students in the past found this article and like 3 different students used it as like their thesis was that the unemployment rate should have more unemployment rates. And their argument was that there are other unemployment rates. So I was like, well, then what's your point? Like, what's your problem? There are unemployment rates. There's more than one. So like, it's not a calculation problem. It's not a data problem. It's a journalistic problem in terms of they're not actually telling you the numbers. And so by virtue of me telling you where they are, you don't need to rely on the newspaper anymore. You can find it straight from the horse's mouth, straight from the economist's mouse click. So, any questions about how I'm calculating this information now, or does that help kind of clarify things a little bit? Cool. One last thing before I move on is the relationship between unemployment. The relationship between unemployment and the labor force participation rate is pretty important. The reason why it's important is one, I will give the article credence to this point it made, is that a lot of news outlets don't report anything besides the unemployment rate, but they should also report the labor force participation rate with it, because you can glean more about the trajectory of jobs in the economy by having them side by side. Now, the BLS press release every month, literally one sentence after it reports the unemployment rate, reports the labor force participation rate. So it's not the BLS's fault that people aren't actually adding in the extra sentence. It's like the person that reads the first sentence of the email, doesn't read all the other important stuff after it, bases their conclusion on that, and then their whole kind of worldview and how they approach things is completely like false or wrong or biased because they didn't actually read through everything and realize what it was about. But anyways, here's kind of the relation. There's 4 relationships that you can have between these 2 measurements. You can have unemployment go up and labor force participation go up. You can have them both go down. So for these first 2 relationships, these are the ones that we most commonly see. The most common relationships are that the unemployment rate will go up with labor force participation, or the unemployment rate will go down with labor force participation. And here's the logic behind the first one. What's the longest you've had to wait for a job, and what's the shortest amount of time you've had to wait to get employed? You can either just drop it in the chat or kind of say how long it's taken you to find a job. 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 days, 2 years, 3 months. So for me, go ahead.
Worked already, because like in Brazil we only start working at 18, and I turned 18 here. Mm-hmm. And like I'm like college athlete, so I never actually worked. So yeah.
So a couple of months. Yeah. A month. So the reason why I asked this is because of the fact that if you started like tomorrow, you weren't working and you're like, I need to find a job tomorrow. There are some jobs that you can get hired pretty quickly for, but usually they're jobs that don't require a lot of training or they have a lot of turnover. And so typically when you have a lot of turnover and not a lot of training, it usually means they're not paying you a ton of money either. So you can usually get into those jobs reasonably quick, but sometimes even those become hard to get. But if you're trying to find like a job that you're going to establish your career in and has the benefits and the stability and the decent salary, usually there's this long song and dance of you apply, you wait weeks, you get the first interview, you wait another week, you get the second interview, you wait another week, and then they offer you it, and then you wait 2 more weeks, and then you start. That song and dance is if you get the job. You could go through that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times before you actually get to that point. And so it can take weeks, it can take months. The unemployment rate is reported every single month. So what that means is that from the day that you enter the labor force, you're technically unemployed. You might be captured in the unemployment rate 1 month, 2 months, 3 months before you get that job. It doesn't mean you're never going to get a job. It just means that that's how long it takes to get in the door. And so naturally, it would make sense that as more people are trying to enter the labor force, that there's going to be more and more of people that are waiting that long to get a job. And so naturally, they're going to be captured in the unemployment rate before they're captured as employed. And so naturally, you're going to see a correlation between more people entering the labor force and more people not being employed at the beginning of their journey of finding a job. So naturally, this happens quite often, that as people start looking for work, more people can't find it right away. But that doesn't mean like initially, or that doesn't mean that forever it's going to keep going up. It just means that until this kind of influx of people in the labor force starts to stabilize and they find work, and then the next group finds work, that there's going to be this kind of correlation where they're both increasing together. The most common type of unemployment rate decreases, particularly at the end of a recession. At the end of the Great Recession in 2009, we actually had this. It was called a jobless recovery, where the economy was starting to grow, but jobs weren't coming back yet. The unemployment rate was dropping from its peak of around 10.6%. But the reality was it wasn't because people were getting hired back. It was because people stopped looking for jobs. So think about that unemployment rate I calculated before. You had 6 people that were unemployed and you had 18 people in the labor force. If one of those people decides to stop looking for work, then this becomes 5 and this becomes 17. And that's going to end up being, I think, about 29.4%. That's clearly less than 33.3. So the unemployment rate dropped not because people were finding work, but because people gave up looking. And so that's not necessarily conclusive of anything good or bad either. Yeah, it's dropping, but people aren't trying to work anymore. And then the other side is like, yeah, people aren't finding work, but at least they're trying. So these ones are the inconclusive ones when they're moving together. The ones where you can make a reasonable conclusion about are the ones in which they move opposite directions. So if we have a situation where the unemployment rate is dropping and the labor force participation rate is going up, or the unemployment rate is going up and the labor force participation rate is dropping. This is good, yay. This is bad, boo. The reason being is this is indicative, whoops, I don't want to use red for that. This is indicative of the fact that as you find, or excuse me, more people are trying to work, but they're finding jobs so fast that the unemployment rate is dropping. So this is indicative of people finding work within 4 weeks. They enter the labor force and they're getting snatched up left and right. They're like, we need someone now. Please work for us. We can't find anybody because there's just so few people entering. And so people are like, okay, I'm entering. It's like the pneumatic tube at the bank where it's just like you like just imagine that like putting yourself in that tube is like the job market, and then you just get sucked up into the tube and then you end up at your job like within seconds. That's basically what that is telling you. That is a good situation because that means that we've got jobs left and right and people are getting in those jobs left and right, and hopefully they're good paying jobs. And usually in this situation there's upward pressure on wages because people can't find anyone. So at the end of this lecture I'll talk about that implication. But that's the good case. The bad case is the opposite. If people are not looking for work, yet unemployment's going up, that's really bad. Because that means that people are giving up looking, which is making this number smaller and this number smaller. But simultaneous with this number getting smaller, this number is getting bigger. So like there's less people trying to work, but there's more people getting laid off at the same time. And so that's not really good at all. Because that's like saying like, oh, like this person left the labor force. 2 people left the labor force, so now we're down to 16. So it should be 4/16. But psych, like 3 of the 12 people that were working got laid off, so now it's 7/16. That's the problem that happens and is indicated by this relationship. So you can glean a little bit more information about the relationship of the unemployment rate and the status of the economy in terms of jobs by coupling these 2 measurements together, which is why I make you calculate them both, because they're pretty important together. So who doesn't count in the labor force? I mentioned it 2 or 3 other times, but here's the kind of encompassing list. Retirees we've talked about. They're out golfing and boating and drinking pina coladas on the beach. I mean, you don't have to be retired to do that, but you have more time for it when you're retired. Full-time students. So some of you already said that you're full-time students. Well, you might also be homemakers or full-time parents, and full-time employees and full-time students. So you might be employed, but also have an excuse to be considered not part of the labor force if you weren't working. The disabled we don't include in the labor force. Typically they're not available, not because they can't do some job, but they've usually traded off working in exchange for some sort of insurance benefit or Medicare or Social Security type payment. So basically, like, I think one of the conditions of that is that you can't work more than a certain amount, or if at all, to collect those payments. So we don't want to include them in the labor force because there's a high propensity that they aren't going to work at all. The military. So I know a lot of people that may be in this class or other classes may be married to or actually serving in the military. Now, you might be like, well, why don't I count? Or why doesn't my spouse count? And the reason why is this. Serving in the military is hard work. It's a sacrifice. There's a lot that comes with it. And that's why you're usually compensated for participating in the military or serving in the military, because of that sacrifice and the work that you're doing. And you could treat it as a job, and it should be treated as a job. But in terms of the actual unemployment rate, the reason why we don't include it is because theoretically, what if everyone joined the military? Okay, if everyone joined the military, then how would we be assessing employment versus unemployment? And how would we assess the status of people working in the private sector? We wouldn't be able to anymore, because if we're counting everyone as employed, then what are we measuring? There's nothing to measure. So the other side of that coin is that in order for us to really understand the status of the economy in terms of jobs that are available for civilians, we need to be able to kind of separate the military from civilian life, so that way individuals can see what's out there for them. So when you leave the military into civilian life, or just people that aren't participating in or serving in the military and they're looking for jobs, what's out there for them? Is it good? Is it a good outlook? Is it a bad outlook? And what level of production is happening that's allowing for jobs to be created? So we talked about GDP before. Production, in unemployment, in terms of who is getting hired, it's usually for the private sector for creating jobs that are going to provide income for households that are going to help improve the standard of living in the economy. So this isn't to say that military people aren't doing jobs and they're not doing hard jobs. It's just to say that because it's part of the public sector, that it's hard to kind of identify. We don't want those people who are currently serving in the military who aren't doing any sort of civilian job on top of it or something like that to be overstating or overinflating the number of people that are employed or in the labor force, because they've got their duties that they have to do in the military. Maybe they're serving overseas, maybe they're serving on base, maybe or some other type of capacity. So we don't want to have that number skewing, just like retirees. We don't want that number skewing the labor force statistics. So, and then lastly, those who are incarcerated, they may be working in the prison, but they aren't available for work outside of the prison. Maybe they are. I don't know. With the internet, you can do anything, I guess. But we don't include them in the labor force because they've got other things that they have to do right now. Now, who doesn't count in the labor force but maybe should? So I don't know how many of you have watched the TV show How I Met Your Mother, but there's this episode where the character Ted Mosby wears a hanging Chad costume to a Halloween party. And the image on the right is the actual physical manifestation of the costume that Ted is wearing. This is a analogy to the 2000 presidential election. So in the 2000 presidential election, it came down to Florida, and basically there was 536 or 537 votes separating Al Gore from George W. Bush. Now, if you've been following history or been alive during that time, you know who ended up becoming president. So, spoiler alert, George W. Bush won, in case you didn't know. But the reality was that there was this controversy and confusion because people in Broward County, maybe another county, were using these punch card ballots. And when they would punch like the hole, it wouldn't rip that piece of paper completely off. And there was this dilemma about whether it should count or not, because some people were having an issue where the ballot wasn't perfectly symmetrical and centered. So they thought they were voting for one person. Usually they thought they were voting for Al Gore, and then they were voting for Pat Buchanan instead, who was the third or fourth party. I think it was the fourth party candidate, because you had Ralph Nader in the 2000 election as well. And so you had people that were like upset because of the fact that they thought, you know what, I tried to vote for this person. After I'd already punched a hole for Pat Buchanan, I realized I was voting for Pat Buchanan and I wanted to vote for Al Gore, so I punched the hole for Al Gore. Or maybe they half punched the Pat Buchanan one and now you got this little piece of paper dangling from it. And so how do we determine the intent of the dangling piece of paper? Is the dangling piece of paper just because it didn't rip off? Or is the hanging piece of paper there because they changed their vote to something else, and that piece of paper that's hanging there is indicative of them changing their mind? And so you have people with magnifying glasses looking at these votes and trying to make some sort of judgment conclusion about votes. And in a state that was so razor thinly contested, so, I mean, I don't think there's been a vote count that's been that close since. So a lot of the states in the 16 and 20 elections were pretty close, but by close, we're talking like, I think 10 to 20,000 votes, not 500, in a state with 20 million people in it. So that's razor thin. That's about as close as you can get with a population that big. So that's why they spent all this time, went to the Supreme Court. But the reason why I'm using this analogy is because these two groups of people, based on the way the survey is conducted, are not considered part of the labor force, are not considered unemployed. But I mean, you could reasonably justify why you would want to include them in the unemployment rate. So the first category of the groups is discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are people who are available to work, but have not looked for a job in the past 4 weeks because they believe no jobs are available for them. So you might be wondering, well, how on earth do we know this? It's because we asked them. So it's not just a simple survey of, did you work or not? Yes or no, the end. It's, did you work? Yes or no. If you didn't work, did you look for work? No. If not, why? And the why isn't a judgmental why of like, why on earth are you lazy? Why aren't you working? Why aren't you looking for a job right now? Instead, it's a question of like, how do we categorize this person? Are they retired? Are they doing something else? Are they sad? Are they marginally attached? What are they? And so like maybe they're secretly at their like happy hour judging these people, but like in terms of how they're actually categorizing them, they're just trying to figure out what category they fall under because they're not fitting the strict definition of unemployed. They're not considered unemployed or part of the labor force. But if they're fitting these other definitions, people might be interested to see, okay, how many people are discouraged and how many of them, or what would the unemployment rate actually be if we did include them? So rather than miss out on this potential data calculation, we asked them some subsequent follow-up questions to get more insight as to what they're thinking. And so discouraged workers are considered not part of the labor force because of the fact that they are not looking for a job. But if you knocked on their door and said, hey, look, I got a job for you, they would probably take the job and they'd be employed tomorrow. It's kind of weird to say they're not unemployed because if someone offered them a job, they'd take it in a heartbeat. But because they haven't actively looked for work, they're not considered unemployed. But by the strict definition, they're not employed. So that's why they're one of these hanging Chad peoples. We don't know where they should fit. They don't fit the definition, so we can't count them, but we want to categorize them in something special so that way we don't miss out on kind of understanding what their plight is or understanding what their reasoning is. And if people are more interested in seeing how those groups of populations are getting bigger or smaller, we have that data available. The second category I like to call the hokey pokey version of the labor force. Marginally attached workers. Hanging Chad sounds awfully like marginally attached, this little piece of paper that's barely hanging on. That's basically what marginally attached workers are. They have not fit the definition of unemployed because they haven't looked for work in the past 4 weeks. But they're these type of people, when you survey them, they're like, I don't know. I might want to go back to work in a few weeks. Kids going off to summer camp. Maybe I can work a job, make a few extra bucks while I have a little bit more time. Maybe I'm going to go back to school. Maybe I'm just going to enter the labor force. I'm not quite sure what I want to do, but I haven't looked for a job, but I might soon. So they're very wishy-washy. They got 1 foot in the labor force, 1 foot out of the labor force, 1 foot in the labor force. They shake it all about. They do the hokey pokey and they turn themselves around, and we count them in the U5 estimate of unemployment. So we're not quite sure what to do with them. So we just take their word for it, saying that they might enter the labor force. So they're the type of people where like discouraged workers, like if you knock on the door and say, hey, look, we got a job for you. They're like, when do I start? Marginally attached workers, on the other hand, are people where you knock on the door and you offer them a job and they say, I'm not sure. So they're considered a different category, and they're considered in a different unemployment rate. The third category of underutilization type groups is the underemployed. Not unemployed, underemployed, which means they actually have a job. Discouraged workers don't have jobs. Marginally attached workers don't have jobs. Unemployed workers don't have jobs. Underemployed people have jobs. But the question is, does the job that they have really match up with what they're capable of, or match up with what they want? And if the answer is no, then they're underemployed. Now, there's a little bit of subjectivity that comes with this when they're doing the survey, because like someone that could be making $100,000 might be like, well, I'm underemployed because I should be making $200,000 a year. Those people will probably not be considered underemployed. But people that have professional degrees or high credentials, and they're trying to find their big career opportunity, but the market is not working for them, and instead to make ends meet, or as the BLS calls it, working for economic reasons, are just working some part-time job to make ends meet and to make a little bit of money to make sure there's a roof over their head. Those individuals are considered underemployed. So the reason why I preface and title this slide, "What do gym teachers and paralegals have in common?" It's because they have 50% underemployment rates, along with healthcare administration, art history, and others. And that might have increased over time. It might have decreased over time since I made this slide, but those are groups of the population that have an underemployment rate of 50%. So the dilemma here is, you're technically employed, but you don't have the capability currently to acquire the job that you're qualified for or providing you with a living wage. So how do you categorize this? Because right now, based on the definition of the labor force, you're considered employed. So how do we capture that as a metric of bad things in the economy? Because I think a large proportion of the population not being able to have a living wage or not working in the jobs they're qualified for is problematic. So, and I think that the BLS agrees with that, and a lot of people agree with that. And so we want to categorize them, and we want to kind of give service to that population in terms of when we're calculating the unemployment rate. But since they're employed, it's a little tricky to do that. So we do have an unemployment rate that includes them. It's known as U6. So even though they are employed, we consider them as quote unquote unemployed for the definition of U6. We group them together with the discouraged workers. We group them together with the marginally attached workers. We group them together with the traditionally unemployed workers. Now I have a coin here. So going along with that 50% underemployment rate, basically that's saying that if this lands heads, you get the job you want with the salary and the benefits and all that stuff. And if it lands tails, you're basically stuck working your minimum wage job. And so if I flip it, it lands heads. I'm a nice teacher. Every time I flip the coin, it's landed heads. So all of you get the jobs that you've been dreaming of. Congratulations. Yay, round of applause. So magically now you're rich. Now go have your money and buy your house and have your retirement and go drink your pina colada on the beach. And if you don't like pina coladas, then substitute it with whatever beverage that you want. And if you don't like sand, then substitute it with whatever that you want. But anyways, underemployed workers are considered part of the U6 unemployment measurement. And I'll talk about U3. I'm mentioning all these U's. You're used to U2, the band. So U2 is an actual unemployment measurement. So people are thinking like Joshua Tree and With or Without You and Sunny Bloody Sunday and Bono and His Island and Nice and stuff like that. There actually is a U2 unemployment. The official one is U3, but U4, U5, and U6 are the ones related to the categories we just talked about. So We'll get to those though. But how on earth did they actually do this survey? So I've told you that they asked them these questions, but who do they ask? How many people do they ask? And how on earth do they get this done every single month? Because I'm sure most of you have never been asked if you're employed or not by the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Census Bureau. You probably never heard of it. So it's like, well, how do they know if I have a job or not if I haven't actively told them? And the reason why is because they do a sample. Every month they sample 60,000 households. And the way they do this is they use the Census Bureau to slice and dice up the population into a way that is giving you 60,000 people to contact or 60,000 households to contact that are representative of the population by geography, the population by ethnicity, the population by age, the population by educational attainment, etc. And so by having a sample that is representative of the total population, they will aggregate that to the 180 million people that are participating in the labor force to say, okay, well, if 4% of this sample is unemployed, we're going to consider that 4% of the total population is unemployed. And they survey these groups continuously, but they don't do it every single month. The reason why they don't want to survey the same people every single month for forever, for like a whole year or something, is we don't want to over inflate in unemployment from people that like just can't find jobs, or maybe they aren't trying very hard or something like that. So they will follow them for 4 consecutive months. Then they'll ignore them for 8 months. Then they'll bother them again for 4 months, and then they'll leave them alone forever. So that way we're not overstating unemployment because we just happen to choose a sample where everybody can't find work. So we'll change the people up every few months. And so for 4 months, they'll survey you. For 8 months, they won't. For 4, they'll survey you again, and then they'll leave you alone. Kind of like jury duty, but less invasive. Well, I guess, but for a longer period of time, and you don't get paid for it. So face-to-face meetings, online responses, and telephone calls. So it could happen in another way. They could knock on your door and say, hey, do you have a job? And then the discouraged worker person's like, are you giving me one? And then they'll be like, no, we're just asking you if you have one or not. And then they'll be like, oh man, no. But you could get an email or you can get a phone call. I haven't been asked, so I can't attest to like what they actually do. I've seen the script of what they ask you, but I haven't actually been solicited for my answer. Now, as I mentioned before, people are in news articles picky about, oh, well, the unemployment rate as it's officially defined is not good enough because it's not including the discouraged workers, it's not including the marginally attached workers, it's not including the underemployed. And therefore, then, like, it's all garbage in, garbage out. Let's ignore it. Let's come up with some new measurement. Like, I don't know. Like, let's just count the number of people that are on the street corner with cardboard signs, and that's our unemployment rate measurement. I don't know what people want to make the metric in lieu of this, but most people that are problem pickers are not solution makers. And so that's why you got to ignore them sometimes. You should take credence to what they're saying if it's legitimate, but if they're just yelling without a solution, then they're part of the problem too. Anyways, the reality is the official unemployment rate does not include discouraged workers, underemployed workers, and marginally attached workers. But again, the U4, U5, and U6 measurements will include these groups in some way, shape, or form. So in the slideshow, you can click on this link that's in here, and it will take you to the BLS table A15, and the table A15 will give you the monthly reported unemployment measurements for all 6 unemployment measurements. U3 is the official one. U1 and U2 are like to more long-term unemployment, so like structural unemployment type of things. U3 is the official one. U4 includes discouraged workers. U5 includes discouraged workers and marginally attached workers. And U6 includes those two plus underemployed. These numbers are not current. They are different than what's listed here. But the trend is natural that as you add more groups, you end up with a higher unemployment rate. But for those who are like really adamant, like if you were like watching this lecture and you're like, why the heck aren't we including discouraged workers? Well, the good news is that U4 is there, publicly available, and you can just report that. If you think marginally attached workers should count, U5 includes them in discouraged workers. If you're like adamant, they're like, well, they're not earning a living wage with their job, so I want them to be considered unemployed because that job is not enough. Well, then you can use U6 as the unemployment measurement. In fact, one of my professors in grad school basically harped on this and was like, use U6 at all times because it is a better barometer of status of people in terms of can they live off of what they're earning and are they able to find a job. And so I remembered that, although I didn't really like listen to his advice. I look at all of them. But U6 can be useful if that's what you're really concerned about. And again, this is also available on the Federal Reserve Economic Database by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. So I think it's fred.org or fred.gov. And you can link on that link and it'll take you to a big, robust website that talks about GDP and unemployment and inflation and imports and exports and different types of price indexes. It's a really neat place where it has Excel spreadsheets and graphs that you can download and play around with. So,
I have a question.
okay.
On the previous slide, when you add in like U4, U5, U6, and you're adding in the discouraged workers and marginal attached, you just add that to the denominator, correct? Not unemployed.
Really good question. I'm glad you asked because I was about to do it and then I forgot and now you reminded me. So I'm not going to admit that I was about to do it because I totally was going to whiff on that. So I'm glad you brought it up. But anyways.
Thank you.
U3, again, U3, the official one is just unemployed divided by the labor force. For U4, what you're going to do is you're going to add the unemployed plus the discouraged worker, not only to the top, but to the bottom as well. You need to add them to the top and the bottom because if you're including them as unemployed, you also need to include them in the labor force as well for fairness and accuracy. For U5, you're going to do the same thing where you're going to do unemployed plus discouraged workers plus marginally attached workers divided by the labor force plus discouraged workers plus marginally attached. When it comes to U6, this is the one that's tricky. Now, I don't think I'm going to have you calculate U6, but just for the sake of understanding, it's useful to share this. U6 is going to be unemployed plus discouraged workers plus marginally attached workers plus underemployed divided by the labor force plus the discouraged workers plus the marginally attached. The reason why we don't add underemployed to the denominator is because they're already part of the labor force originally because they're working. So they were already considered workers. So now we're taking the portion of the workers that were already considered in the original labor force and putting them in the top and saying that they're unemployed now. And so U6 and U5 will have the same denominator, but U6 will have a numerator that includes the underemployed. But for everything else, these are the way that you calculate it. For U3, unemployed over labor force. U4, add discouraged workers to both the top and the bottom. Marginally attached goes in the top and the bottom for U5. And then everything goes up on top for U6. But for the bottom, you only leave it as the denominator from U5 because underemployed employees are working. And so for every other calculation, they're considered part of the labor force and part of the employed portion of it. So I appreciate the question, and hopefully that clarifies what you need to put in. And then don't forget to multiply times 100 at the end to make it a percentage instead of a decimal. So is there another way in which we calculate employment? The answer is yes. This one has like a bunch of names that you might hear. The official name is the Current Employment Statistics Survey, also known as the CES. The actual official unemployment survey is called the CPS, or the Current Population Survey. This is also known as the Establishment Survey. This is also known as the Non-Farm Payroll Employment Survey. So any of those names are the same thing. Non-farm payroll employment, current employment statistics, CES, Establishment Survey, all of them are the same. This survey is not going to calculate an unemployment rate. It's just going to give you an aggregate number of jobs that exist in the economy based on their estimates from the BLS. This survey basically contacts 146,000 different businesses across 623,000 different work sites. And all they do is they call them up and say, how many people are on payroll this month? So if you're running a small business and you're included in the survey, it'll be like, how many people on your payroll this month? 3, 2, 4, 5. And then they say, thank you, hang up, mark you, log you. And then they do that 629,999 more times. And then from that sample, they aggregate it up based on how many businesses they've estimated that actually exist. And then the net change between the number that they get for this month versus last month is how many jobs were created in the economy. So I believe last month the number was 71,000. So basically what they did was they said, okay, like business A has 17 people, business B has 20, business C has 13. We add that up and we compare it to last month where they only had 15, 19, and 12. So now because last one they had 15, 19, and 12, and now we have 17, 20, and 13. There's 4 jobs that were created between January and February because there's 4 more people on payroll. That's it. That's all the measurement is how many people are on payroll. And so if there's more people on payroll this month than last month, then we say that many jobs are created. If there's fewer jobs this month than last month, then we say that those jobs were lost. So it's a net change. So if we have, again, we had the 12, the 19, and the 17, and now we have 13, 20, and 19. The total number here is 12, 31, 48. The total number here is 52. So 52 minus 48 is 4. So that means that 4 jobs were created. That's all it does. You just take a bunch of numbers here, add them all together, subtract them from the previous number, and that's how many jobs were created. Now, if it's smaller, then it was jobs lost. But in this case, it was bigger, so we had 4 jobs created. Yay! Good job, economy. Now, one of the shortcomings of this is what kind of jobs were they? Are they minimum wage jobs? Are they salary jobs? Are they benefits providing jobs? We don't know. It's just a number. Just like with the unemployment rate, it's just a number. We don't exactly know whether they're good jobs, bad jobs, mediocre jobs, somewhere in between. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Any questions about this? Okay. So basically, this slide just is talking about the fact that if you ever see political ads that talk about that under this person's watch, this many jobs left or came into the economy, basically it's just going to say that basically they're just taking this survey and they're just aggregating it out over a long period of time. So like in the last presidential cycle, I definitely heard like pre-pandemic the incumbent candidate, basically there was like 12 million jobs that were created, and then the challenger says, well, but they lost like 15 million jobs because of the pandemic, and so there was a net change of negative 3 million jobs over the whole term, therefore they suck. Like all of these like different ads that were coming from every angle that was just using this data. It's just a number. Like, did they physically do it? Probably not. So like some of it might be they're doing, some of them might not be they're doing. But Democrat, Republican, green, yellow, purple party, doesn't matter what party it is, they always use this, no matter who's in office and no matter who is both good or bad. And so now you know where that number comes from. If you ever see a political ad or an advertisement on YouTube that's like, so and so lost jobs or so and so created jobs, what a hero. It's basically just using this establishment survey data over the whole length of time instead of month to month. Now, in terms of actual unemployment, so we're back to the OG unemployment of like actively looking for work and haven't worked in the past week. We can break that down into 3 specific categories. We have frictional unemployment, which is going to be kind of your standard issue. I'm entering the labor force, I'm filling out job applications, and eventually I'll find something. Structural unemployment is the long-term unemployment that occurs when we kind of change the structure and like eliminate industries or change industries in our economy. And then cyclical unemployment is based on recessions and the phases in the business cycle. So like when we have a recession, the jobs don't all come back at once. So even though like we shut down the economy in March and then we reopened it again in June and July, and we haven't opened it fully, but in some places we have, there's still a 2 to 3% level of unemployment that still exists in the economy from the pandemic recession from last year. So it doesn't go away immediately. And so sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years to get rid of cyclical unemployment. But all in all, it's all coming from the fact that we had a recession. So the first one is frictional unemployment. This is basically the example of unemployment where it's like, okay, like, yeah, I haven't found a job yet, but there's one out there. Like I've got 7 interviews lined up, or there's 50 positions that match my qualifications that I just have to sit down and apply for. One of them will pan out. It's just going to take some time. That's frictional unemployment. It's not that you're never going to find a job. It's not that you're not qualified for a job. It just means that there is a time in which you enter and you get hired. So the application process takes time. The interview process takes time. The negotiation process takes time. The hiring and the training process takes time. And so the time between you entering and the time you getting hired, that is frictional unemployment. And so we talked about it before, where if you have a bump up in your labor force participation rate and also you have a bump up in your unemployment rate, you're going to end up with this type of unemployment. So we consider it natural unemployment. It's the natural rate of unemployment. This is part of it. When you couple it with what's known as structural unemployment, these are the 2 types of unemployments that we consider natural unemployment and not as a result of a recession. And so the official definition is that it's short-term unemployment that arises from the process of matching workers with jobs. So again, it still might take a couple of months to find that job, but that doesn't mean that you can't find it. So usually something between 1 and 6 months is considered frictionally unemployed. So you could just be graduating into the labor force, being in between jobs. So over the summer, last year, I was considered unemployed because I was leaving my previous institution and I was joining my new institution. And It wasn't that I didn't have a job lined up. It wasn't that I was searching for work. It was just that I didn't have a job. Now, you could argue that I was not part of the labor force because I wasn't actively seeking employment. But if I was, then I'd be considered unemployed, not because I was in desperate need of a job, but because I was just looking and trying to pass the time between one job and the next job. Now, on the other hand, we have structural unemployment, which is not so great. Structural unemployment is the type of unemployment that we probably focus most of our bandwidth, energy, and efforts on from a political perspective and from a public policy perspective. So whenever we have presidential elections and town halls, it's like, I'm a coal miner from Gillette or West Virginia, or I'm a oil worker in Texas, or I am a school teacher in middle of nowhere, Missouri. Like these, or I'm a steel worker in Pittsburgh or something like that. These, or an auto guy from Youngstown or Detroit. It's always the people whose industries were like the epitome of the economy between 1940 and 1978. And now, as we've globalized and our economy's been more technology and service based, the emphasis on those jobs have been minimized. And so those people are trying to figure out what to do next. They're like, well, my steel mill left town, my auto factory closed down, my coal mine shut down. What do I do now? Am I supposed to just sit here and rot? Am I supposed to go chase down the one remaining job that matches my skills on the other side of the world or the other side of the country? What am I supposed to do? And so that's structural unemployment. It's not to say that you can't get a job. I think this definition is a little elitist, I would say, like in terms of saying like, oh, well, there's a persistent mismatch between your skills because you have none, son. It's like basically this situation where you have skills, you're very specialized at what you did, it paid the bills, it gave you a good solid chance of retirement, you have a nice house, and like you're 20 to 25 years in your career and you just don't know what to do, you're shell shocked. So like there's this period of time where you're like, well, I don't want to give this up. If I can find a way to cling on to this career and just kind of finish out the last few years so I can get out and retire, I want to do that. So you try that for a few months and then it doesn't happen. It just keeps getting worse. So structural unemployment is this situation where it's like you're trying to kind of match up with what you used to have, but it's just not there anymore. But that isn't to say that you don't have skills. It's not to say that you can't acquire new skills. And it's not to say that you can't get a job whatsoever. But we do categorize this long-term unemployment this way because usually this is a crossroads type of unemployment. It's a crossroads for government and public policy to be like, how do we help these people and how do we kind of maintain that community from crumbling and infrastructure and prosperity? But at the same time, it's a crossroads for the individual person as well because adaptation is just kind of a fact of life. It's harder now in our economy because it almost feels like you got to basically leapfrog between careers to retirement for like the budding generations. And then people who are kind of like in this singular career just kind of get like blindsided and we're like, well, that economy doesn't exist anymore. And so it's hard for them to kind of transition. So when it comes to this, it's unfortunate. It's considered natural because of the fact that industries get replaced. That is natural unemployment. When you go from being all about manufacturing to being all about service, and all the people that were manufacturers, like their existence and their jobs are gone, so now they have to pivot to something else or just move to where it is. Now some people don't want to move because then they have to give up their house, and housing prices are a lot more expensive than they were when they bought the house. And so like yeah, they could get a decent chunk of money and they can live off that for a little bit, but then they have to rent, and then that changes their standard of living. But then you also could be the type of person that's transient, that tries to find the job. So there's a lot of transient workers in the oil industry, or even in military, so to speak, because you're going from base to base and moving around. But and so like if you're a military spouse, or if you're an oil field worker, or you're even a coal miner or a manufacturer, like it's not, it's kind of these days comes with the territory. It's like, oh, well, we're moving now. Okay, fine. But at least you are finding the job that pays the bills, so you're adapting to that. But if it comes to the point where the job isn't there and the job isn't anywhere, what do you do? And so at that point, that's where a lot of community college students are coming from, is they're retraining, they're acquiring new skills, they're pivoting careers, and they're acquiring new opportunities to be able to transition to a new economy type of position. And so I think it's interesting because we need to define structural unemployment so we can categorize short-term versus long-term unemployment. But I think one of the things that economics textbooks and economists fail to acknowledge when we define it like this is that structural unemployment almost sounds like you're looking down on a certain group of people that can't find jobs, as if it's their fault. And most of it isn't. Most of it's just a byproduct of the economy. But at the same time, there needs to be a semblance of balance and realism that, like,
Something that you brought up in like one of the very first lectures was like how the animators kind of lost their job because of Pixar, and Pixar is great, but like it was like a new technology, a new way of doing it. So it doesn't mean that the original people that were drawing or, you know, coming up with all the, it's just like that's what keeps coming up in this situation too, is like they probably don't understand technology the way they're doing animation now, and then that was replaced.
Yep, exactly. And the thing is too, is that it's difficult because some of those old fundamentals are still critical in the industry. And so maybe you can angle your way into it by saying like, hey, look, like you can do it with all this technology, but you don't understand the underlying technology. And I think there's a lot of discussions about that today with technology, particularly, is that particularly with Gen Z, the argument is that Gen Z is the most technologically savvy generation, but the reality is that Gen Z is the most technologically inherited generation, meaning that they really they take their phone out and they pull out their camera and they take these pictures and they push in this filter and they do all this stuff, and they're like, look at me, I'm a Photoshop wizard because someone else created a technology that's so easy to use that anyone that is young enough and willing enough and understands technology enough can like make these creative things that you used to basically have to be like a Photoshop wizard with, mind understanding all the underlying technologies 20 years ago. But someone figured out to create a computer program that automatically does all that work for you, so you don't have to manually do it anymore. And then everyone just is like, well, I'm so good at this because because someone else did it for me. And so like there's this dilemma there where it's like, okay, well, what if that stuff breaks? Like, how do you do it? Like if you were like, I'm a graphic designer and your experience is using the iPhone touch-up techniques, like when you're applying for a job in graphic design, like how do you justify like your knowledge? Like if you have to like tweak the inner workings and the programming and the code and all that stuff, how do you do it without having the ease of use technology? And so as we move forward in our economy, it's tricky we need to make sure that we don't think that because we were given something that we know that how it works. We just know how to use it, but we don't necessarily know how it works. And that's actually kind of what a lot of this class is like. I could give you the I could tell you where to find the unemployment rate, and I could make your final exam Google search the unemployment rate, tell me what it is. Congratulations, you know that. But I want you to understand the underlying techniques of why we use it, why we calculate it this way, why it's good, why it's bad, and then you can make your own decisions as to whether one way is useful, one way is not, and how you want to kind of run your business. If you're using this for business purposes, make decisions based on how the economy is, where you want to move, where you want to live, etc. And so, like I said, these industries, these long-term unemployment type situations aren't necessarily a as it's defined here, a situation where it's like there's a mismatch because you don't have anything to bring to the table. It's just that the way we value things in the society and the industry change in how we value those things. And so you kind of have to adapt and mold yourself to be marketable enough to get the food on the table and pay the bills with the skills that you have. And so maybe we need to teach you new skills. Maybe you need to convince people that your skills are worthy and basically, or start your own business, like some of these people have amazing skills and amazing abilities, but because they're not using them in a specific way, like people don't think they're valuable, but they're really critical for other reasons. And so when I think about structural unemployment, I just think about where I grew up and where my family and my in-laws live. And so my parents were born, my mom was born in Cleveland in the city, but then they moved out to the suburbs in the 70s. And then my in-laws, they work at a glass factory, and it's basically there because there's a giant Honda plant. And so I just think about like what would happen if that Honda plant just decided they got a tax break in, I don't know, Kansas, and they just leave. Well, they hire, I don't know, about 15,000 workers. So if that plant shuts down, that entire economy is gone. And so the question then becomes like, what's next? Because that plant isn't going to be refilled. Maybe you're lucky and maybe people see the value in your abilities, and then some other company kind of sneaks in and takes advantage of the already existing infrastructure. So there was a plant in Lordstown, Ohio, that was a General Motors plant. It closed down. This electric truck company named Lordstown Motors has gone in, rehired some of the people, but it isn't as many as people as were working there before. I think it's like 10 or 20% of what was working there before. So yes, they saved some jobs, but what about the other 80% of the people? And so the question then becomes, how do we protect these small towns? How do we build these communities up? And the reality is that a lot of the public policy arguments is we're just going to bring back your job. And the reality is that doesn't do anybody any good. There was an article in, I think it was CNN, I can't remember. There was an article about 2-3 weeks ago about Gillette. And it was a really long article about the coal industry in Wyoming and basically people living in Gillette, and like in like the public services, they'll be like all about coal is forever, save the coal jobs. But in their private conversations, they're like, we're not going to stop this from dying. So what do we do to keep Gillette from completely folding when coal just kind of disappears? It's not going to disappear tomorrow. It's not going to disappear next year, but we slowly see this long, slow burn of these jobs dissipating. And you're also seeing it with the economy in Wyoming because of oil prices having downward pressure, natural gas prices having downward pressure, less dependency on coal. The tax base is eroding, and that's why the institution had to cut, I think, 17 positions last year because of budget cuts, and the state itself had to cut its budget by 20% because of the fact that you're losing all that tax revenue. So how does Wyoming transition? Well, this goes back to the structural unemployment thing. The biggest initiative that the state is doing right now is all about education. There is a goal that by 2040, that 70% of all adults will have at least an associate's degree and hopefully a bachelor's degree. And so if they just took every single high school senior in the state and they had them graduate from UW by 2040, they'd only be at 48% of adults having higher education degrees. And so to get to 71%, they've got to take people who haven't been to college before that are already living there, and they have to get them to go back to school because they know that the economy's got to transition some way, shape, or form in the next 20 years. So when we talk about money, we'll talk about how Wyoming is trying to emerge in terms of cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and stuff like that, they're trying to basically be like the main state they're like trying to be like the Delaware of cryptocurrency. So I don't know if Delaware is like where all the corporations are at. So basically Wyoming wants to do that. And also they're trying to boost educational opportunities because they see that the economy might have to transition and they might have a big issue with structural unemployment if they don't make some sort of pivot. The last type of unemployment is cyclical unemployment. And so this is unemployment that's caused by a business cycle recession. So the logic here is that if the economy is weak, production will decrease. And if production decreases, they don't make as much stuff. And if they don't make as much stuff, they don't need as many workers to make the stuff. And so they'll end up laying people off. When they lay people off, that results in less production on top of that. And then they cut even more costs and cut even more labor. And then you have this downward spiral of decreased employment. So at the height of the Great Recession, unemployment was at 10.6%. At the height of the pandemic recession, unemployment was at 13.8%. This dropped all the way down to about 3.3%. And then this one is currently around 6.1%. So if I go to the next slide, the estimated natural rate of unemployment, meaning when all cyclical unemployment is gone, is estimated to be around 4.37%. So that means that even though we've dropped unemployment substantially since the peak of the pandemic recession, the unemployment rate is still about 1 to 2% higher than where we would expect it to be at the natural rate when we were starting 2020 in the 3.5 to 3.6% range. So the reality is it took about 7 years to get to about 4.5% from 2009 to 2016. That is when we finally reached a point in which all the cyclical unemployment from the previous recession was eradicated. And even though we opened quickly and we decreased a lot of that unemployment from the shutdown, we still have some 2% of unemployment from people that either are displaced by industries that still haven't opened yet, like concerts and sporting events and restaurants. Also, we're dealing with the consequence of people who are losing their jobs because their business couldn't survive the pandemic, meaning that they were already treading water and living very like hand to mouth and paycheck to paycheck in terms and week to week in terms of their operations. So when you shut them down or you cut their capacities or you limit their cash flow for just a couple of weeks or a month, then that might be the difference between them staying open for another year and them just saying, you know what, it's time to close up shop. We can't make it through another year. And I don't want to disadvantage or risk destroying my personal financial situation by trying to keep this business afloat. And so there's a lot of people displaced from jobs because their businesses just kind of shut down because they couldn't handle the pressure of the recession. Now, there's a bunch of discussions you can have about that in terms of, is that a indication that we should have kept things open, or is that just an indication of people that already had businesses that probably weren't going to succeed regardless, and we just sped up the inevitable? Could make both arguments in some way, shape, or form, but regardless, cyclical unemployment is strictly related to layoffs from recessions. And the thing is, though, is that the economy does not recover immediately. There is always a time lag between people starting to boost the economy again and the actual jobs returning, because there is a time gap in terms of rehiring those people, re-ramping up their production and stuff like that. So this recovery was quite quick, which we expected it to be because of the fact that a lot of the unemployment was from shutting things down. But there will be some long-term consequence over the next 1 to 3 years where some of the situations that could have already happened because of the recession haven't happened yet, like evictions and back rents on businesses and other businesses that have held on this long but might not be able to hang on much longer. Or once they reopen, they realize that they tried to stay open, but they just didn't have enough solvency. So just because unemployment keeps dropping doesn't mean that it's going to continuously drop and that the recession is over. We might actually hit another one this year because of all of the long-term, I call it like the accordion economy, where basically we have all this pressure being pushed on us to keep people from getting evicted, keeping businesses afloat and stuff, that when like we actually reopen the economy, a lot of those businesses and all that evictions and all that stuff is going to like trigger all at once, and that might cause another recession. So, but that's the third type of unemployment, cyclical unemployment.
I have a question. How, I guess, accurate? I mean, obviously, econ equations, things like that, but like, how accurate is it? Because I know with unemployment, there are very strict rules, like how long you can be on unemployment. So, like, that has a huge factor on like this. Like the recession, it could be people had just lost their jobs right when everything closed, but they don't have access to those benefits anymore because they've run out, or that some states like Wyoming are late on benefits. Nothing has been kind of restarted. So I guess like I'm wondering how accurate is that, and like how do you decide that?
So here's the thing. There is a couple of things to take away from your question. The first one is that just because you fit the definition of unemployed does not mean that you're collecting unemployment benefits. There's a difference. There's actually, that was a big thing that a lot of people were talking about earlier in the year, was that there was this disconnect between the number of people that were claiming unemployment and the unemployment rate. It seemed like the unemployment rate was below it. And part of the reason was because, one, a lot of those people may not have been eligible based on a number of circumstances. Two, they might not have been actually unemployed by the definition of unemployed. So they might have been considered furloughed or something like that, where they're collecting unemployment benefits based on the state rules, but by the BLS's rule, they're actually temporarily away because they haven't actually like permanently lost their job. They actually agreed to take 2 weeks off so they could collect unemployment and then save the business money and then return. So that's what a lot of colleges were doing, a lot of high schools and a lot of administrative positions were doing. They're taking furloughs to try and save money for the institution, and then they would get some money from unemployment. So there's that part where the numbers aren't exactly matching up because there's different definitions and different states have different policies. And also when the benefits run out again, like someone might have been unemployed for 50 weeks before this happened. And so like they exhausted their benefits, so they can't get them now. The second takeaway from that is, so you were saying about the people and the definitions. So I'm trying to think of the second takeaway that I had from that was during recessions, there tends to be an extension of benefits. So during the Great Recession, it's usually, I think, 20 weeks that you can get unemployment in most states. They extended that out to 52 weeks initially, and they actually extended it out to 104 weeks in the second year of the recession. So in like 08, they extended to 52, And then I think in 2009, they actually extended it a whole extra year. So you could keep collecting unemployment. It's up to 2 years after your official week of claiming, assuming you were jumping through all the hoops that were necessary. And so the reason why they do that kind of lends me to my next discussion here is this first consideration with unemployment is unemployment insurance. So when you collect unemployment, it's actually an insurance. And the reason why it's implemented is because of the fact that we don't want the recession to snowball. Because if a bunch of people keep losing their jobs and they have no money, then nobody buys anything and the economy completely collapses. So by providing these insurance payments, what we're doing is we're mitigating the severity of things so people at least have enough money. It's not enough money for everything, but it's enough money to pay something, pay your rent, buy food, buy groceries, buy diapers, whatever you need to buy, medicine. It's there for that reason. And so the extension of those benefits usually speak to the fact that we are in a recession because they're correlated with higher unemployment rates. If everyone's unemployed, then they usually extend it out because they're like, well, we aren't going to just solve this problem in 5 months. It's going to take longer than that. So we want to make sure that those benefits are there. So that way, like, we're slowly getting footing throughout the summer, and then fall rolls around, everyone loses their benefits, and then bam, like we're back to where we started, which is kind of part of what they were worried about with the extra unemployment that they were offering in 2020 was like, oh, the $600 is gone. And so what happens now? And then you had some people that were like, well, see, like people aren't working because they're making more money by not working. And so that's a problem in the system. And then the people on the other side are like, exactly, that is a problem in the system because you're not paying us enough money. So like, yeah, of course, if I'm getting $2,400 a month when I only make $1,200 a month on minimum wage, then heck yeah, like why not take advantage of that? But so like some people were looking at it from the angle of like you're mooching, and then other people are looking at it from the thing of like, no, when I work my butt off, I make half as much money, so maybe I deserve a vacation for working all this time for half as much money. So you had all of these discussions about it. But long story short, the way they estimate cyclical unemployment is there is a forecasted natural rate of unemployment where they're saying like reasonably based on how bad the recession was and based on where the unemployment was during the recession, once we get to 4.5%, 4.3%, that pretty much means that all the people that were laid off or couldn't find work, they've either found jobs, left the labor force, or they've transitioned to structural unemployment because of the fact that they happen to be initially a casualty of the recession, but then the recession caused a structural change in the economy, and then they just basically got their whole industry eliminated. So this could happen now if like people just start leaning into alternative energy. Like there's two things that you can look at from that. So if we go into like I don't want to say Green New Deal because there's a bunch of like people don't like that terminology and they instantly ignore what I'm saying after when I say it. But basically, I'm not saying Green New Deal in terms of everything that it is, but basically what it is saying like let's just lean into alternative energies like wind and solar and water and electric cars and all that stuff. So if we lean into that, you have two consequences. The first consequence is you have a completely new infrastructure and you have a completely new set of things that you need to build, and you need to make it in mass quantities. So there is a ton of jobs that are going to come from that. First off, you might have to train people. So like we have what the wind energy arm of the institution, basically, because as we invest in wind, you need people that know how to work on the turbine. So you have jobs for technicians, jobs for construction, jobs for engineering, jobs for that. You can, and if like the middle of nowhere is going to be like where our new like energy grid is coming from, you might build a whole new city out of it. Who knows? Maybe, I don't know, maybe Wheatland is going to be the next Kansas City. I don't know. But like you could have these situations where you have those booms, but at the same time, you have the problem where by changing the structure of your economy, all of those people that were in oil and gas and fossil fuels and stuff like that, if you don't transition them or get them kind of first in line for those new jobs, then they're going to end up going from maybe they were laid off because of the recession last year in Gillette or Casper or even here. And then they end up not, and then basically those businesses just shut down. And maybe it's because they're being beaten out by the alternative energies, or maybe they're investing in that. And then you are stuck kind of holding the bag, trying to figure out what to do next. And so, cyclical unemployment is just usually an estimate, but reasonably, it's just the distance between what the Federal Reserve estimates the natural rate of unemployment is and the current unemployment rate. So, like at the peak of the recession, it was 13.8 or 13.2. We're down to 6.1. So there has been a lot of recovery, but again, it doesn't, just because people have jobs doesn't mean they're good paying jobs. And just because people have jobs doesn't mean that they're not going to disappear when like things go back to normal and we make some hard choices about like, what do we do for our long-term strategic plan? Like, yeah, we just want to get back to normal and like we want to see people again and watch football games again and listen to live music again and eat in restaurants again. And like some people are already doing that, but like the mass quantities of people doing it without feeling like they're going to die of COVID. Once that's taken care of, then the question is like, okay, now that our economy's at status quo, like what next? Like, is the way it is good enough? And if the answer is yes, then whatever. But if the answer is no, then what do we do? Do we move into alternatives? I mean, you look at GM, Tesla, basically we're all in on the electric car movement now, which is even funny because I watched a documentary from the 90s called Who Killed the Electric Car? We could have had this 30 years ago, but we're doing it now. And so we're doing it now. And so GM and Tesla and Volvo and Volkswagen, they're all leaning on the electric car thing, which means that you now also have to build an infrastructure for that too. So like gas stations turn to charging stations. Now you got to build that infrastructure, build battery stations and stuff like that. So there's a lot of opportunity that's going to create a lot of jobs for the next few decades. But I think people are scared about losing what they have. This is actually a behavioral economics thing about people are more scared about losing something that they have and than gaining what they could get. So like if someone offers you $50, the positive feeling that you feel of someone giving you $50 actually is less than the pain that you feel if someone stole $20 from you. So like the reality is people are loss averse. They're not risk averse, they're loss averse. And so like for someone who is told that in order for you to have a nice solid paying career for the next 30 years, you have to lose that, you have to get rid of and leave the job that you've had for 12. Like even though like on the other side of the retraining and the new skills and the new opportunities, you might end up richer than you ever thought you could be and have a better career, safer career, and retire harmoniously. But if you've committed your whole last 12 years of your life to something and you thought that's what you were going to do until you retired or died, like it's not something that you're going to easily just be like, okay, fine, sure, whatever. Like it's just like if you grew up in a house and someone bought you a nice bigger house, like you have all these memories in this old house, it's hard to let go of it even though the new opportunity is better. You end up getting over it, but that initial feeling of like, oh man, like this is too hard and I don't want to leave this behind, that's what people prey on. That's what they're like, oh, well, like, guess what? You don't have to let it go. Who cares about that stuff? That's all a pipe dream. Like we're going to give you back your oil pipe dream in terms of like building a pipeline instead of building a wind turbine. So that's where people run into trouble. The last thing I'll talk about is in regards to the minimum wage. So I think we might have talked about this before, but I'll talk about it in formality here. If we go back to our good old-fashioned supply and demand curve, quantity on the x-axis, instead of price, I'm going to put wage because W is wage. This is going to be the labor market. So you have a downward sloping demand curve. Instead of demand being you buying a good or service, demand is a business hiring you to do a job for them. And then there's an upward sloping supply curve like this. So the market wage is going to be this point right here. It's where basically the marginal, this is a microeconomics thing, but the marginal revenue product of labor, basically the additional revenue that the company receives from hiring you, that has to be greater than or equal to how much they pay you. And so this in equilibrium point is saying that the last worker that's hired in the economy at this wage rate is worth as much as they're paying them. Everybody else is getting paid less than how much they're worth, but they're willing to work for less, so they're fine with how much their wage is. So that's the equilibrium market wage. That's how much the average person in the economy, based on whatever industry this is, that they should be getting paid based on market forces that we learned about earlier. However, minimum wage, the argument that people make is that if we raise the minimum wage to $12, $13, $15 an hour, that the minimum wage is going to be up here. And minimum wage is an example of a price floor. And so if you have a price floor that's above equilibrium, then that means that you have a market failure. And what ends up happening is this is the amount of people that end up working. And you have an unemployment surge between how many people were working before and how many people are working now. So basically, if you look up market failures and price floors, basically, if you have a price floor that's binding, it means that you can't charge the equilibrium price anymore. You have to charge something above it. And so if the something above it is the minimum price you can charge, then that's the minimum price. That's the maximum price that's going to be charged, basically, because businesses or workers or whoever is selling the product is not going to, would like to make more money, but consumers aren't willing to buy it at that higher price. So in this case, the consumer is the business and you are the laborer. And so when there's a price floor of a minimum wage that's above the market wage, then the theoretical argument is that this many people are willing to work for that wage, but there's only this many people willing to hire you. And so this distance between Q star and QF is the increase in unemployment as a result. That's the economic theory and the logic behind why people don't like minimum wage increases. But that is operating under the following assumption. That is operating under the assumption that minimum wage is actually above equilibrium market wage. But we don't know if that's actually true or not. Whoops. We don't know if that's true or not. Because the problem is that what a lot of businesses do is they take advantage of you and they say, well, the government is forcing me to pay you this amount of money. Therefore, that's how much you're worth. I could pay you less if I wanted to, but because the government is forcing me to pay this much, I'm going to pay this much. But in reality, you're worth a lot more to them than how much they're paying you. So in reality, even though minimum wage is here, what'll happen is theoretically what should happen. Let's say this is $9 and the actual equilibrium market wage is $13. Okay. So you're worth $13 an hour and you should be getting paid $13 an hour based on an efficient market. But because of the fact that there's this kind of price fixing and collusion that's happening between all businesses, they're saying, hey, guess what? If we all pay them $9, they'll take $9 even though we know they're worth 13, because you don't know how much you're worth because you don't have access to their books and their profit margins. But they know how important it is to pay you and how much you need to live and how much you need the job. And so what they'll say is like, you're only worth $9. Take it or leave it. And then you're like, well, I'll go somewhere else. And then they charge you $9. It's basically a collusion and a price fixing scheme where basically they take the psychological advantage of minimum wage being like something that you just associate with your value because that's how much it is. And that's how much the government is forcing them to pay you. And they also take advantage of the asymmetric information of the fact that you don't know how much you're worth to the company because you aren't an accountant yet. So, how do we know you're worth more than $9? How do we know you're worth more than $7.25? Well, the nice thing in 2018 and 2019 that happened was unemployment was at 3.3%. Okay. So minimum wage in Wyoming was what, 7.25? It's actually 5.15, but 7.25 is the federal minimum wage. Yes, it's true. And so the federal minimum wage is 7.25. I had a student 2 years ago who was in my class, and they said they were the manager of a Subway in town. I don't know which one, so I don't know which one to avoid. Maybe all of them. I don't know. But anyways, the Subway in town, she was a manager of, or assistant manager or manager of the Subway. She's making $8 an hour. $8 an hour to manage the Subway. She came to my office hour and said she was super stressed out because of the fact that she apologized that she didn't do so well on a homework, or that she was falling behind in terms of getting her paper done because she was having to work extra shifts at her job because someone quit, and then her boss is basically screaming at her on the phone telling her to come into work, and then she'll fire her if she doesn't come into work because she's the assistant manager and she needs to do this and she needs to do that, and she should be loyal to the company and blah, 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 blah. And she was just telling me she's so stressed about this. She's so sorry. And I'm like, how much are you making? That's what I told her. I was like, how much are you making? She's like, I'm making $8 an hour. I was like, you do realize that every other business in this town is paying $13 an hour at minimum wage. So yeah, you won't be a manager, but you'll have a lot less stress and you'll be making a lot more money. And she was like, wow, I didn't realize that. I just was so locked into making sure that my boss was happy and that my job was done that I didn't really realize that I was getting ripped off. And I'm like, yeah, you're getting ripped off. And so she quit her job the next day, and she was like, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks focusing on studies to get through the end of the semester, and then I'll find a new job. And then she found a new job in town that paid $5 to $6 more an hour. So that was the nice thing about the low unemployment rate, is that it basically took the Scooby-Doo mask off of the economy, where basically you had this price fixing where it's like, oh, well, because you're worth $7.25, because the government tells me you're worth $7.25 or $8 or $9, I'm going to pay you that much. But because of the fact that there wasn't enough workers available because unemployment was so low, it forced people to pay more money, because they're like, if I really need to fill this position, I got to pay somebody more money to take them away from working somewhere else because there isn't enough workers. So that's the point of the natural rate of unemployment, is there might be 3 people for 20 jobs. So if you need 20 workers and there's only 3 available, you hire the 3 available, but then you got to steal 17 workers from some other business. And so how do you steal them from the other business? You pay them more money. And so everyone was competing to get the same pool of workers because they needed to fill their staffs and fill their shifts. And so you got this endless upward pressure on wages. And so that's why Panda Express and Target and everyone's was paying $13, $14, $15, $17 an hour starting, because of, one, increasing cost of living prices in Cheyenne, but also because of the fact that they didn't have the luxury of just telling people that they're only worth $9, because they had to actually tell them how much they were worth in order to get them to come to work for them. And so now the jig is up and the mystery is solved, and we know that the Scooby-Doo ghost was actually a corporate head at McDonald's or something like that. And so that's why minimum wage increases may not be as consequential as they would have been if we would have done a fight for 15 3 years ago before the labor shortage. So that doesn't mean there aren't some implications. There's a lot of people that are small businesses that are worried about it. But my pushback for that sometimes is that like small businesses are great for the community. We always like to talk up small businesses. They're the backbone of the community and they're important, and they are. They're critical. But my biggest problem with small businesses in terms of their argument against minimum wage and their arguments a lot of times is because they don't have any business acumen. So the important thing, if that you're studying business or you're studying accounting, is that you understand the underlying cost structure and the uncertainty and the market forces that dictate your business and how they control your business. Because the mistake that people often make is they look at it from the perspective of revenue, not the perspective of cost. And they think that, oh, well, I can charge $7 for this thing and everyone loves them because they charge $7 for this meal and it costs $14 at the restaurant up the street. And the reason why it costs $14 at the restaurant up the street is not because they're ripping you off. It's because they're paying their employees like what they're worth. And so a lot of small businesses play this game of like, we're a pillar of the community because we're providing jobs, but the jobs they're providing are paying the $7 minimum wage that everyone's complaining isn't enough to pay their bills with. So like you're providing a job, but it's still not solving the problem. And so when they argue about minimum wage going to $12, $15 an hour, my argument was like, you want to be part of the community, you want to help hire people, and you want to create jobs. You need to build that into your business plan and your business model so that way people will actually be able to work at your place of employment and not have to have 7 other jobs to be able to have a roof over their head that isn't living at your actual job that you're giving them. So those are my comments on minimum wage. Those are my comments on unemployment insurance and how the implications of them are. So the reality is yes, that thing where if it's above the market wage, yes, it will cause more unemployment. But the reality is that in 90% of all the cases, it's going to actually not really change anything in terms of unemployment because it's just forcing people to pay people what they're worth that they should have been paid forever. So that's my thoughts on minimum wage. And that's my comments on unemployment.